The Lives of the Saints by Father Alban Butler, May 30th, St. Joan of Arc. St. Joan of Arc was born on Epiphany 1412 in Domremy, a small village in Champagne on the banks of the Meuse. Her father, Jacob d'Arc, was a landowner of some importance, a good, frugal, and somewhat sullen man. Jean's mother, who loved her 5 children tenderly, educated her 2 daughters in domestic chores. Joan later declared, "I know how to sew and spin like any woman," but she never learned to read or write. The family's neighbors, in the process of the saint's rehabilitation, left moving testimonies of the young woman's piety and exemplary conduct. Both the priests who knew her and her playmates testified that she liked to go to church to pray, that she frequently received the sacraments, that she took care of the sick and was particularly kind to pilgrims, to whom more than once she gave up her bed. According to one of the witnesses, she was so good that the whole town loved her. Apparently, Joan had a happy childhood, although somewhat troubled by the disasters that plagued the country, and by the constant danger of an armed attack on the town of Domremy, located on the border of Lorraine. Before undertaking her great enterprise, Joan had to flee at least once with her parents to the village of Neufchâtel, 13 kilometers away, to escape from the hands of the Burgundian pirates who plundered Domremy. Joan was still a child when Henry V of England invaded France, ravaged Normandy, and claimed the crown from Charles VI. France was at that time divided by the civil war between the supporters of the Duke of Burgundy and the Duke of Orléans, so that it had not been able to quickly organize resistance. Moreover, after the Duke of Burgundy was treacherously murdered by the men of the Dauphin, the Burgundians allied themselves with the English, who supported their cause. The death of the rival monarchs, which occurred in 1422, did not improve the situation in France. The Duke of Bedford, regent of the English monarch, vigorously pursued the campaign, and the cities fell, one after another, into the hands of the allies. Meanwhile, Charles VII, or the Dauphin, as they insisted on calling him, considered the situation hopelessly lost and indulged in frivolous pastimes at his court. At the age of 14, St. Joan had the first of the mystical experiences that were to lead her along the path of patriotism until her death at the stake. First she heard a voice which seemed to speak to her closely and saw a glow. Later, the voices multiplied and the young girl began to see her interlocutors, who were, among others, St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. Little by little, the apparitions explained the overwhelming mission to which heaven had destined her. She, a simple peasant girl, was to save France. In order not to arouse her father's anger, Joan kept silent. But, in May 1428, the voices became imperious and explicit. The young woman was to appear before Robert de Baudricourt, commander of the royal forces in the nearby village of Vaucouleurs. Joan got an uncle of hers, who lived in Vaucouleurs, to take her with him, but Baudricourt scoffed at her words and dismissed the maid, telling her that what she needed was a good spanking from her father. At that moment, the king's military position was desperate, for the English were attacking Orléans, the last stronghold of resistance. Jeanne returned to Domremy, but the voices would not let her rest. When the young woman replied that she was a peasant who did not know how to ride a horse or wage war, the voices replied, "God commands you." Unable to resist this appeal, Joan fled from her home and headed back to Vaucouleurs. Baudricourt's skepticism disappeared when he received the official news of a defeat that Joan anticipated, so he not only consented to send her to see the king, but gave her an escort of 3 soldiers. Joan asked to be allowed to dress as a man to protect her virtue. The travelers arrived at Chinon, where the monarch was on March 6, 1429, but Joan did not get to see him until 2 days later. Charles had disguised himself to disconcert Joan, but the maid recognized him at once by a secret signal communicated to her by voices, which she transmitted only to the king. This was enough to persuade Charles VII of the supernatural character of the maiden's mission. Joan asked him for a regiment to go to save Orléans. The king's favorite, La Trémouille, and most of the court, who considered Joan a visionary or an impostor, opposed her request. To settle the matter, the king decided to send Joan to Poitiers to be examined by a commission of learned theologians. At the end of an interrogation that lasted at least 3 weeks, the commission declared that it found nothing to reproach the young woman and advised the king to prudently avail himself of their services. Joan then returned to Chinon, where preparations began for the expedition she was to lead. The banner, which was specially made for her, was embroidered with the names of Jesus and Mary and an image of the Eternal Father, to whom 2 angels presented on their knees a fleur-de-lis. The expedition left Blois on April 27th. Jean was at the head, dressed in white armor. Despite some setbacks, the army managed to enter Orléans on April 29th, and its presence worked wonders. By May 8th, the English forts surrounding the city had fallen, and at the same time, the siege was lifted. Joan received an arrow wound below the shoulder. Before the campaign, she had prophesied all these events with approximate dates. The Maid would have wanted to continue the war, for the voices had assured her that she would not live long. But La Trémouille and the Archbishop of Reims, who considered the liberation of Orléans as the work of good fortune, were inclined to negotiate with the English. Nevertheless, Joan was allowed to undertake a campaign on the Loire with the Duke of Alençon. The campaign was very brief and yielded the overwhelming triumph over the troops of Sir John Fastolf at Patay. Joan tried to immediately crown the Dauphin. The road to Reims was practical, mind conquered, and the last obstacle disappeared with the unexpected capitulation of Troyes. The French nobles put up some resistance. However, they eventually followed the saint to Reims, where on July 17, 1420, Charles VII was solemnly crowned. During the ceremony, St. Joan stood with her standard next to the king. With the coronation of Charles VII ended the mission that the Voices had entrusted to the saint, and also her career of military triumphs. Joan boldly launched an attack on Paris, but the enterprise failed due to the lack of reinforcements that the king had promised to send and the absence of the monarch. The saint received a wound in the thigh during the battle, and the Duke of Alençon had to drag her away. The truce of the winter that followed was spent at court, where the nobles looked at her with ill-concealed suspicion. When hostilities recommenced, Joan came to the aid of Compiègne, which was resisting the Burgundians. On May 23, 1430, she entered the city, and that same day organized an attack that was unsuccessful. Because of panic, or due to a miscalculation of the governor of the square, the drawbridge was raised too soon, and Joan, with some of his men, were left in the moat at the mercy of the enemy. The Burgundians knocked the maiden off her horse amid furious shouting and carried her to the camp of John of Luxembourg, for one of his soldiers had taken her prisoner. From then until well into the autumn, the young woman was a prisoner in the hands of the Duke of Burgundy. Neither the king nor the companions of the saint made the slightest effort to rescue her, but abandoned her to her fate. But if the French forgot her, the English were interested in her and bought her on November 21st for a sum equivalent to £23,000. Once in the hands of the English, Joan was lost. They could not condemn her to death for having defeated them, but they accused her of sorcery and heresy. As witchcraft was then the order of the day, the accusation was not extravagant. Moreover, it is certain that the English and Burgundians had attributed their defeats to the magic spells of the Holy Maiden. The English took her, 2 days before Christmas, to the castle of Rouen. It is said, without sufficient foundation, that they first locked her in a steel cage, because she had tried to flee twice. Then they transferred her to a cell, where she was chained to a stone bench and watched over day and night. On February 21st, 1431, the saint appeared for the first time before a tribunal presided over by Peter Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, an unscrupulous man who hoped to obtain the archiepiscopal see of Rouen with the help of the English. The tribunal, carefully chosen by Cauchon, was composed of magistrates, doctors, clerics, and ordinary clerks. In 6 public sessions and 9 private sessions, the tribunal questioned the maiden about her visions and voices, her male clothing, her faith, and her willingness to submit to the church. Alone and without defense, the saint faced her judges bravely and often confounded them with her skillful answers and her very exact memory. Once the sessions were over, a crude and unfair summary of the young woman's statements was presented to the judges and the University of Paris. On this basis, the judges determined that the revelations had been diabolical, and the university charged her in violent terms. In the final deliberation, the court declared that if she did not recant, she should be handed over as a heretic to the secular arm. The saint refused to recant, despite threats of torture, but when she found herself in front of a large crowd in the cemetery of Saint-Ouen, she lost her courage and made a vague recantation. Let us say, however, that the terms of her recantation are not preserved, and that there has been much discussion about the fact. The young woman was taken back to prison, but this respite did not last long. Whether by her own will or by the trickery of those who wished her death, it is certain that Joan returned to dress as a man, against the promise that her enemies had wrested from her. When Cauchon and his satellites went to interrogate her in her cell about what they considered as an infidelity, Joan, who had recovered all her courage, declared again that God had sent her and that the voices came from God. On leaving the castle, Cauchon is reported to have said to the Earl of Warwick, "Be of good cheer. We shall soon have done with her." On Tuesday, May 29, 1431, the judges, after hearing Cauchon's report, resolved to hand the saint over to the secular arm as a renegade heretic. The next day, at 8 o'clock in the morning, Joan was taken to the marketplace of Rouen to be burned alive. The conduct of the Holy Maiden on that occasion was touching. When the executioners lit the stake, Joan asked a Dominican friar to hold a cross at the level of her eyes and died invoking the name of Jesus. The saint was not yet 20 years old. Her ashes were thrown into the Seine. More than one onlooker must have echoed the bitter comment of Jean Tressart, one of King Henry's secretaries. "We are lost. We have burned a saint." 23 years after Joan's death, her mother and 2 of her brothers asked for the case to be re-examined, and Pope Callistus III appointed a commission to do so. On July 7, 1456, the commission's verdict fully rehabilitated the saint. More than 4.5 centuries later, on May 16, 1920, Joan of Arc was solemnly canonized. On the occasion of the canonization, interest in the saint was reawakened in England as well as in other countries. Inevitably, this interest favored the development of legends. Such, for example, is the legend of the Protestant Joan of Arc, popularized by George Bernard Shaw, with an excusable error because the author was not sufficiently familiar with Catholicism, but it is nevertheless an error. A variant of this legend is the dramatized Saint Joan, a figure partly attractive and partly without relief, but in any case unreal. There is also the legend of the nationalist Joan of Arc. It is true that Saint Joan was a great patriot, but on her lips the word France only meant justice. Another legend is that of the feminist Joan of Arc, which is undoubtedly the most absurd of all, both from the historical point of view and from the point of view of the saint's feelings. Of course, there is also the Joan of Arc of statuary, of which the statue in Winchester Cathedral is an example. Finally, let us mention the error of those who believe that the Church venerates the saint as a martyr. What was Joan of Arc really like? Simply a well-endowed peasant girl, from the human point of view, with a lot of common sense and full of God's grace. Since she knew the story of the Annunciation well, when God's will was revealed to her, which must have seemed less extraordinary to her simplicity than it does to our complication, she knew how to recognize it intelligently and submit to it. Such is the Joan of Arc, revealed in every line of the original trial documents. Other lessons can also be drawn from these documents, some of which do not do us Catholics credit. True, the tribunal that condemned the saint was not that of the Church, but among the clerics who supported the verdict were several ecclesiastical personages of importance, some of whom were men of goodwill and some of whom were not. The condemnation of Joan of Arc is an indelible stain on the history of England.